Hey guys, today's video is all about world building. So let me ask you something. Do you think of awesome worlds for your story? You know, these crazy, wacky things that don't exist in real life that you can use for your fiction story? But then as soon as you sit down to write your story, maybe you have a hard time incorporating that world into your story or just wish you could incorporate it more. Or alternately, maybe you don't think much about world building at all. Maybe your world is the last thing you think of when you come up with your story. So by default, it's just the background of where your epic plot takes place and maybe nothing else. If either of these things or anything similar describe you, we need to have a little chat. Think of it this way. Think of your story as a plant. The inner arc of your character is the seed. It holds the potential for growth and transformation, same as a plant does. The plot is what grows out of that transformation. It's the stem, the branches, the leaves, what we can see, we as the readers who are absorbing your story, reading your story, what we can see happening on the surface, right? But what about the world of your story? Where does that come in? The world of your story is the soil. So think of the biblical analogy of trying to plant your seed on a rock. If you're not using any kind of world building at all, it's really hard to nurture your story and make it grow. You can try to plant it on a rock, but not much is going to happen, right? Now, I think that most of you who are watching this video are already better authors than that. Not many of you are using zero world building, but just for the sake of illustrating what would happen if you didn't. Now, your world can either be rich, nourishing soil, which means a world that is tied deeply to the inner arc and the plot. It's going to feed the roots of the character's journey, influence how the plant grows and what direction it leans, how vibrant it becomes. The plant needs it, the soil, to thrive and bear fruit. Okay, it's the same thing with your story. Your story needs the world. It needs the world building to serve as a vehicle, as something that holds it and guides it and will help your character along in their journey. Now, on the flip side, if you have very poor, dry soil that isn't going to do much nurturing, then your world is just a backdrop. And yeah, your plant, your story may grow, but it's going to be very weak. It's going to have thin stems, pale leaves, very little fruit. Even if you pick that fruit, it's not very good. You get the idea, okay? So you can still technically have a story without the world building, but it's never going to be as lush or emotionally resonant as if you use your world. And here's the real kicker. A master gardener chooses the right soil for the right plant. Just as you, the storyteller, should design your world to be the exact environment that forces your character to change, struggle, and grow. So we're going to talk about that in this episode. By the end of this video, you'll know how to use your world as an obstacle that drives both the plot and the character transformation, okay? So the next question to ask then is, what if your story world was your character's biggest enemy, right? It really needs to be something that's going to challenge your character, trip them up, force them to change. Let's get into that a little bit more. The first thing you need to do when it comes to building your world is decide what emotion is prevalent in your world for the character and also for the reader, because whatever the character is feeling, that's the vibe the reader's going to get. I really was thinking about this as I was putting together this episode and thinking that it really is dependent on a lot of things, but when I write my worlds, there's always a dominant emotion that goes along with the world. Very often this is based on genre, okay? Obviously, different genres are going to have different vibes to them, but it can also be based pretty heavily on what your character is feeling, what your character is going through, so your inner arc is going to influence this, and how you want the world to be, okay? So when I think about my worlds that I write, for example, one of the genres I write is crime and mystery. Obviously, those worlds are going to have kind of a mysterious, not mystical so much, but there's always a big question mark of what's going on here, right? So they're dark. There's a lot of unknown and uncertainty in them. And the worlds I write are not exactly cozy. I don't do cozy mystery. So my worlds have elements of horror in them, right? They can actually be pretty spooky at times. Whereas if you're writing cozy, then that's going to be different, right? For historical fiction, I tend to do medieval. So there's definitely a sense of helplessness on the part of the people because of the way medieval worlds were. There's definitely, there's a sadness. I've heard it described before, and I really love this description, that because historical fiction is usually based or written, I guess, against the backdrop of really tragic historical events, things like wars and death and disasters and things like that, there's kind of this collective sadness that also goes with historical fiction. Like, on the one hand, we understand the human element. On the other hand, we're going, how could something like that have actually happened to people, right? And so there's this very sad and kind of grieving sort of feel about historical fiction worlds. And mine are definitely that way, but probably not everybody's is. And then for sci-fi and fantasy, obviously there are a million different vibes because there's a million different types of sci-fi and fantasy. My dystopian sci-fi tends to be darker. I think most dystopian is, it tends to have an air of oppression because that's what dystopian is a lot of the time. Whereas the dragon fantasy world that I'm writing is more inspirational, and even though there's definitely drama and there's definitely conflict and some of it's pretty horrific, on the flip side there's also this feel of this mystical empowerment, right? So that's what I mean. Decide what the emotion is for your world, and once you pull it out of your brain and are able to define it in a very concrete way, write it down on paper, it's much easier to incorporate that emotion into your world. And one thing you can always ask if you're struggling with some aspect of world building is, okay, here is my emotion. How can I reinforce that emotion through this bit of world building that I'm struggling with? And that can help give you answers to your questions, okay? The next thing you need to do is define the rules of your world. Go over each element of your world and decide what the rules are. So this is where you're going to get those world building PDFs. And yes, I do have one. I will put the link to it in the caption if you want to go ahead and get it. But there are so many different things that you can and maybe need to consider. There are politics and the economy and the government and the way everything is set up. There's the geographical element. There's the urban versus rural factors. I mean, we could go on and on. If you're doing a fantasy, there might be magic, there might be science, And then we get the rules of the organizations or institutions. In a crime fiction world, I usually write detective fiction. So the characters who are in law enforcement are subject to the rules of law enforcement. Okay, that counts as world building. In the historical fiction, if it's a medieval time, then the characters are subject to the rules of their society and probably the monarchy that they're living under, right? So all of this goes into world building. Now, most people sort of do world building by default. And just the fact that you're authors, just the fact that you can compartmentalize the way that authors do and put yourself into your world, that goes a long way. I'm not going to lie. Okay. But if you can actually be very intentional and sit down and write down what the rules are of your world in each of these areas, it doesn't have to be detailed. You don't have to build out a 100-page long society complete with encyclopedia and everything like that. No, just define one or two rules in each area that will define your world and that your characters will have to live by. Now, as part 2 of this, remember, the rules only work if there are consequences for breaking them. So you also need to list the consequences your character will undergo if they're going to break those rules. Now, they can be very physical consequences, as in if you break a law, you get put in the stocks, right? Or they can be something more non-physical. Maybe it's an emotional thing. Maybe it's a magical thing. Maybe it's, the loss of a relationship. But either way, no matter what it is, physical, non-physical, sky's the limit. You need to know what that is. You need to know what the consequence is if your character breaks one of the rules of the world. And as a bonus exercise, maybe even brainstorm some ways you could show that in your story. That way your brain is getting going, getting thinking on how to mesh your world building with the plot of your story, right? Next, I want you to tie the rules to the inner arc. Now, you guys know that I am huge on the character's inner arc. Most people, it is an afterthought or a secondary thought, and they don't plan it all that much. Well, introduce yourself to me. I'm going to give you like 13 different points to plan your internal arc before you plan your plot. And yes, I'm aware that most people come up with their plot first. That's perfectly okay. But the internal arc should never, ever, ever be an afterthought. It needs to be the basis of your story. And that includes tying it to the world building, right? The world's biggest restrictions should reflect the character's main flaw. Let that sink in for a minute. The world's biggest restrictions, not all of them, not all the rules of your worlds, but the biggest ones, should reflect the character's main flaw. In my speak, I would say it should reflect their limiting beliefs, right? Whatever they are struggling most with, the world should reflect that. So for example, A rebellious character in a rigid conformist society that's divergent, right? If the society is trying to oppress them, dang it, they need to be rebellious, right? It's going to kind of a give and take tug of war with the things that they are, the things they struggle most with, the things they're most flawed with. A selfless hero in a world that punishes altruism, such as in Les Mis or The Giver, or a powerless person in a power-obsessed hierarchy, Game of Thrones, Tyrion. You get the idea, right? So think about that. Think about how your world might challenge your character, might reflect back their biggest flaws, might push them into overcoming their limiting beliefs in some way. The tighter the rules, the more the character must transform to succeed. And story, remember, according to Vogler, is all about transformation. A story is a metaphor for a journey that leads to change, and that change is on the character's behalf, right? So the more the rules tighten around the character, the more they have to push back, but the more they have to transform in order to succeed, right? Because they're either going to transform or they're going to lay down and submit to the rules, which generally is not what we want in fiction. That doesn't make for very good fiction, or at least not for very long. Then you're going to weave the rules of the world into your plot. So what I always tell my students is to take each of the steps in the 10 plot points and ask how they can be, the world can be a stumbling block for their character at that point. Now, there are no hard and fast rules here. You don't have to do this with every single plot point. You're not failing as an author if you can't think of something, 37 different ways your world is going to interact with the arc. Of course not. This is just ways to come up with ideas, to find a few ways here and there to tie your world into your character's inner arc and into the plot, right? So there's no hard and fast rules, but the more often your world plays an active part in your story, the more cohesive your story will feel to the reader. And remember that a cohesive story creates powerful emotions for the reader. And the more powerfully you can make them feel something, the more they're going to become a mega fan of yours and return to read every single thing you've ever written, okay? In the end, the protagonist is going to need to either break the world's rules, change the world's rules, or change themselves to live within them, okay? So think about that for a minute. If there are rules that, there are some rules in some worlds that are just made to be broken. Enter Hunger Games, right? Sometimes you need to change the rules. So this is where they change up the government, or they change up the magic system, or they do something to fulfill an old law and make way for a new one, things like that. Or they're going to have to change themselves to live within them. There are some stories where maybe they don't need to change the rules of the world, but they can still triumph over those rules by changing themselves and the way they interact with things. So it just depends on what kind of ending you want. And really, that's going to inform what kind of story you're telling. So this is just another thing to think about. Think about what you want them to do in the end. And once you have that, I always say, figure out your ending first and then reverse engineer, and then you can go back and fill in a lot of blanks. But let's talk about some frequently asked questions about world building, okay? How do I avoid info dumps when explaining my world's rules? Well, the best way to do it is to not explain your world's rules in a paragraph, not like, just so you know, this is what happens in my world. No, you need to show it through the character action and through the character interacting with the world and learning the consequences for themselves. So like I said before, show the character breaking a rule and what happens to them. And if that doesn't work for your story because, breaking a rule results in execution or something, and obviously you don't want that for your main character in the first act of the story, show somebody else breaking the rule and what happens. Show the extreme consequence for breaking that rule, and have the character either experience it or observe it and have their thoughts on it, their emotions, their reactions to it. And that will really well establish for the reader, because it's through doing, through experience, through the eyes of the reader, that they're going to learn that, okay? So don't explain in a paragraph, don't info dump, break up the rules, the ones you want them to know, and then show the character as they go through their day, throughout their life, them interacting with the world in a way that explains the rules through what the character either experiences or observes, okay? What if my rules don't naturally connect to my character's flaw or their inner arc? I'm not going to ask you to change your inner arc. Chances are, once you have that nailed down for your character, you're not going to want to budge on that. I completely understand. But if that's the case, I would try to change the rules of my world, or I shouldn't even say change. I don't like that word in this case. Just try to find some way that they become relevant to the inner arc. And the best way you can do this is through journaling. So turn it over to your subconscious mind. So, sit down, whether it's with a pen and paper or at your keyboard, take a deep breath, kind of get into a meditative state of mind a little bit, and set the intention that you want to figure out how to tie your world, the rules of your world, to your character. And then just start either writing or typing. This is free writing, it's brain dumping. And I promise you, your subconscious mind will give you answers if you do this, okay? Maybe there's some things you need to add in order to connect them, or maybe there are already connections there, you're just not seeing them. Another thing you could do is talk to AI and ask them to help you, to help you flesh it out, or to give you ideas, something like, hello, ChatGPT, or whatever AI you're using. This is my character's internal arc, or this is my character's flaw, and these are the rules of my world. How can I connect those? Or give me some ideas for how the rules of the world might mirror my character's flaw. And AI will come up with all kinds of ideas, most of which won't be usable, but it might kickstart you into what you need. It might, jog something loose so that you can figure it out. So subconscious mind, AI only as a tool. Can I change the rules mid-story? Officially, no, because that would mean you've completely undermined everything you've done in your story up till then. But I do think that sometimes when authors ask this, what they're really asking is, can I change the rules of my world in a way that, the rules of any society may change? And then the answer is yes. It just has to be logical. So as I spoke about before, maybe the main character will actually change the rules of the society or of the magic system. Maybe, just the rules of whatever the world is, they can change if they're changing organically due to stuff that's happening in the world. So the laws change, or the oppressive regime changes, or the character finds some way to use the magic a different way, or use a different kind of magic. That's all fine, as long as you have logical breadcrumbs in the story so that it makes sense. So there's not just like a change that's not explained, right? But what you can't do is that you as the author can't suddenly change the rules in the middle of the story and expect the reader to follow you. Your readers are insanely intelligent, and they're going to go, whoa, 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 whoa. That is not what you said before. They're going to catch you on it, and then you're going to get bad reviews and no one's going to want to read your stuff. So don't do that. If you're going to change the rules, work out logically and organically in the story why that's going to happen. Make sure and explain it to the reader. Make sure your characters understand it. In fact, your characters should be driving it if that's going to happen, and then you'll be okay. But that's not really the same thing as changing the rules mid-story. It's really just the story and the plot developing so that things change, right? Subtle difference, but makes all the difference in the world. What if the reader doesn't notice the rules? They should feel them, even if not overt. So there's a few different ways I could go about this. If you are communicating the rules correctly on the page efficiently, they will notice them. If they're kind of unspoken rules, then yeah, they will feel them. But like I said, readers are really intelligent. And when they are reading a story, they're actually looking for patterns and connections. So, I mean, haven't you ever been watching a movie, and even though maybe the character didn't break the fourth wall and turn to the camera and explain the rules, like by watching them and by watching what's going on, you're going, oh, okay, so if he does this, then okay, got it. You know what I mean? The character or the readers will do that. So you don't have to be super on the nose about it, but showing it through the character and their actions moving through their world is going to be the best way to communicate it anyway. And then of course you can have characters talk about it, have a conversation about it. That's totally fine too. But the point isn't to make your readers notice the rules. It's not to like force them and, this big blinking neon sign. That's not what you want. They will pick it up by default anyway. So I don't really think this is something you have to worry about, so long as you are communicating the rules within the story effectively. How much is too much detail? This one's a hard one to answer because it's very subjective, but I would say that is, you don't want to overdo it with the details. Again, you don't want to rub your reader's nose in it in a way that makes them annoyed, right? But you need to have enough on the page to communicate the rules well, to communicate the world well, and in terms of description, to really ground them in the experience of that world. So this comes back to 5 sensory details. Telling is not a good thing. Always show. And I also talk a lot to my students about thoughts, feelings, and bodily sensations from the character. So as they're observing parts of your world, what are they feeling? What are they thinking? And what are they feeling in their body, right? So as long as you are effectively communicating them. On the one hand, I want to say there's not too much detail. It's just however much detail it takes to communicate that effectively. But on the other hand, you don't want to go overboard. So the best way to gauge this by far, bar none, is to get another set of eyes on it. Okay. Once you become a more seasoned author, you get a much better feel for how much is too much. But until then, find a critique group, find other authors who will swap chapters with you, and you can help each other and critique each other. And they can tell you, okay, you're giving me a little too much here. This, and this was sufficient, and you don't need all of this, and that's how you learn. That's how you're going to finally figure out the correct amount of detail to give in description. Common mistakes to avoid: rules are too vague, which means no tension. We've kind of gone over that. The world feels like a backdrop rather than driving the story. Make sure the world drives the story. The rules are unfair, but the protagonist can ignore them with no consequence. Okay, so this goes back to there have to be consequences for breaking the rules. You can't let the protagonist or any character ignore those consequences. The only time this really happens is if the consequence becomes inconvenient in the plot. But you guys, you can't do that. You have to figure it out. You have to find some reason to get it, or some way to get around it, or you're going to have to change things. So this is a big one when you're first starting out. You got to make sure that you're planning for this and you don't have any plot holes here. Over-explaining instead of showing rules in action, or forgetting to escalate consequences. So I think we've covered all of those pretty well. So I'm going to issue you a challenge. Choose one major rule in your story world and write a scene where breaking it forces your protagonist to confront their flaw. Now, there's a good chance, and I'm going to encourage you to do this, that the flaw we're talking about is not part of the plot so much as it is an internal thing. So breaking the rule should force them to confront what they are grappling with internally. Okay. Write a scene, or if you want to just journal it out, do some free writing and see where it takes you. Okay. And then also experiment with how the world pushes back when they break this rule, and maybe how that affects them internally, since they're grappling with something emotional anyway. Okay. This is a really good exercise for not only figuring out your world building and how your character will interact with it, but also it's a good test to see if you have enough world building in your world. If you're not doing this and you have nothing in your story where something about the world is forcing the character to grapple with their internal arc or is pushing the plot forward in some way, you've got some work to do, my friend. You need to up-level that world building, right? So just to recap today, the rules of your world are not just cool weirdnesses. Don't have dragons just because they're awesome. And I write dragons, so obviously I think they're awesome, but that's not enough, right? They need to be a big part of your story, right? They're going to feel like villains to the character. Your world is going to be a stumbling block for your character. It's going to feel like an antagonist in and of itself to the character. Now, I personally, as the author, I don't like to see the world as an antagonist. I prefer to see it more like a wise mentor that forces the character to confront their weaknesses so that they can overcome them, and ultimately guides the character on their journey of transformation. But to the character at the time, it's going to feel like the world is a villain, and that's as should be, okay? So that's what I have for you today. And if you want more help and support with this, if you want to know what you need for your world building, what questions to ask, and how to answer them for your unique story, join us in the Legendary Fiction Forge. We have courses that give you an A to Z blueprint for everything you need to plan and craft to make your genius story idea into one with perfect emotional flow, so it will hook the reader and keep them turning pages until the end. We also have open Q&As, coaching, right with me on Zoom sessions for accountability, a community of like-minded authors who are also working toward getting their masterpieces out to the world, and so much more. So if you're looking for tons of support and encouragement on your writing journey, come join us. Information is below in the caption. Beyond that, have a wonderful week of writing. Get out there and create cool, difficult, amazing, nefarious worlds that only you can come up with to help the character in your story transform. See you next time.